وصحبه وسلم تسليما ولا حول ولا قوة إلا بالله العلي العظيم. Alhamdulillah. Who studied Ibn Ashur before? Anybody else? Ibn Ashur has 3 sections. We'll start with the section on juristic principles. But before I do that, just a few things about who's actually practicing. Is everybody consider themselves Maliki? Everybody? Yeah. Okay, good. Okay, so I'll talk a little bit first about the madhabs, and then particularly Malik's madhab, and what the distinctive qualities of his madhab are. First of all, the basis of the religion is obviously revelation. So the Prophet ﷺ had a revelation which wasn't just the Quran, because he said, "Utitul Quran wa mithluhu." I was given the Quran and I was given the likes of the Quran, which is the Sunnah or his. Generally, the ulama use Sunnah and Hadith to be synonymous, but the Malikis actually differentiate between Sunnah and Hadith. They don't consider the Hadith Sunnah, so to speak. The Sunnah is specifically practice, and some of the practice was transmitted through practice. It wasn't transmitted through Hadith. So Imam Malik, the practice of the people of Medina, he considered it to be Sunnah, even though there wasn't a Hadith necessarily relating it. I'll give you an example. There's a Hadith in which the Prophet ﷺ prohibited fasting on Friday. But Imam Malik found the people in Medina, the ulama of Medina, fasting on Friday. So he said, I'm not going to take one hadith, an isolated hadith, and leave the actions of the ulama of this city, because they were doing this in front of the Sahaba, and they probably took it from the Sahaba, and the Sahaba didn't say, oh, the Prophet said don't fast. So if there was a solitary hadith, and there weren't a lot of people that related it, Imam Malik just did not consider, because the hadith, there's a vast number of hadith, and many of the hadith are not, they have no application at all. And there's a lot of fabricated hadith. The potential for a hadith to enter into the corpus, even if it has a sound matan, is still not real high, but it's there. The probability is there, and it's actually a reasonable probability. It's not an outrageous probability. So that's why there's a great rigor in how the fuqaha look at the hadith. The fuqaha have a completely different attitude towards the hadith that the muhaddithun have. And Abu Hanifa radiallahu anhu is a good example of that, where he rejected many absolutely verified sound hadiths because they went against certain principles. And this is where the nuance of the nuanced understanding of the fuqaha really comes into confrontation with the simplistic understanding of people that preach the book and the sunnah. You know, there's certain people now. There's always been that strain historically in the Muslim community, but there are people who say we should just follow the book and the sunnah, as if somehow these previous people weren't doing that. They were doing something else. But when you get into the deeper you study this, the more you realize that not only were they following the book and the sunnah, but following the book and the sunnah is not as simple as it would outwardly appear, especially in light of language and the multiple possibilities for meaning and how meaning is interpreted in language, and also the fact that there are contradictory hadiths, which the Muslims have never denied, and there are abrogated hadiths, there are abrogating hadiths, and then there are questions that arose that different fuqaha resolve them in different ways. Does a mutawatir hadith abrogate a verse in the Quran, for instance? So, what is the relationship to the Quran and the Sunnah? These are all problems that were examined early on in the community's history. So when you look at the schools, certain schools arose very early on. Ibn Abbas radiallahu anhu, it was known if people wanted an easy fatwa, they went to Ibn Abbas. If they wanted a hard fatwa, they went to Ibn Umar radiallahu anhu. So even in Medina, there was an acknowledgement of different approaches to the text. Ibn Abbas reflects more the Bani Hashim approach, and Ibn Umar reflects more his father's approach, Umar ibn al-Khattab. The Prophet ﷺ said, if there was a prophet after me, it would have been Umar radiallahu anhu. So, and he also said that if Umar took a path, Shaitan would take another path. Umar is the only one that had what are called the muwafaqat, where he was of the opinion of something, and then the revelation would actually affirm his opinion. And in a few instances, it actually confirmed his opinion in contradistinction to the Prophet's opinion about something, from taking the advice of the Sahaba. The Prophet listened to them, and then he took the advice, and Umar radiallahu anhu's advice turned out to be in accordance with the revelation. So, a lot of people now, unfortunately, view the madhabs as that they're somehow not following the book and the sunnah. And so they call people to directly going back to the sources. And the problem with that, the central problem is this. In order to access the source material, you have to have a vast amount of ancillary knowledge. If you don't have that knowledge, you're just not going to be able to study these sources. The first criterion is just Arabic mastery. And Arabic mastery is doesn't mean you speak Arabic or that you can read or write Arabic. Arabic mastery takes many, many years, and even today it's questionable whether anybody could really master the Arabic in the way that it was mastered in that early period, because they were in direct contact with people that understood these things immediately. So Imam Fairuz Abadi said, and many of the scholars of grammar say, لا يحيط بالعربية إلا نبي. Nobody will encompass the Arabic language except a prophet. And nobody, even some of the ulama of language said that nobody in the history of Islam has ever claimed to know all of Arabic. Nobody's ever made that claim in the history of Islam, to actually know all of Arabic. So the language is vast. There are many, many points. There's a lot of differences of opinion about prepositions in the Quran, what prepositions mean. And I'll give you a couple of examples to show you just about how they arrive at different things. One of them is, there's a hadith that the Prophet ﷺ said, whoever fasts Ramadan and then follows it up, atba'uhu, with 6 days of Shawwal, right? So people know that, right? It's a good thing to fast 6 days of Shawwal. What he said, min Shawwal, and used min in the hadith that Ibn Majah relates. And that hadith is one of the hadiths that's used by the fuqaha. But Imam Shafi'i understood the min to be min at-tab'id, because there's a type of min, like akaltu min al-khubz, I ate from the bread. So it means akaltu ba'dan min al-khubz, I ate some of the bread. That's min. There's also min al-ibtida or min al-bayan. There are different types of min in language. So like you say, nunaziru min al-Quran. In the Quran it says nunaziru min al-Quran. That's min, means the whole Quran. It's just a min yubayyinu ma yunazziru minhu, like that. It just clarifies what's being revealed. So the min there is actually a type of min that you could just take it out and you'll still have the meaning. Nunazzil al-Quran. Then you have like min al-ibtida, ataytu min Makkata, I came from Mecca. These are all different types of one preposition in Arabic. And so in that hadith, Imam Shafi'i said that it was tab'id. The min was tab'id. And so you had to fast in Shawwal. Imam Malik said the min is for ibtida. It means beginning with Shawwal. Whoever follows up 6 days beginning in Shawwal. If they follow up Ramadan with 6 days, then they, then they get then they get the reward as if they fasted the whole year. So that's an example where the imams are looking at the identical nas, the same nas. That's called a nas. They're looking at the same nas and they come to different conclusions. Completely. One says you can fast any time during the year and you get that reward. The other says no, you have to fast specifically in that month. Those are two valid opinions. Now, this went on with many, many things in the Sharia. There are many examples of this, about these very subtle linguistic differences. For instance, in the Quran it says biru'usikum, when it says that you famsahu biru'usikum, like wipe your heads. The ba there, according to Imam Shafi'i, was ba of tab'id. Right? It meant the ba of part of something, partitive. So Imam Shafi'i said you could just do a little bit, based on his linguistic understanding. Imam Malik said, "Laysa min al-Arabiyya ba'a tab'id." You know, there's no ba'a tab'id in Arabic. That was his opinion. But Imam Shafi'i was a master of Arabic, so his opinion's as valid as Imam Malik in that, because they're at the same level in terms of their ijtihad. So Imam Malik said the ba there is za'ida. It's an extra ba, which there are many examples of that in the Arabic language. So Imam Malik said it meant you have to wipe the whole head, not part of the head. That's an example, same text, different conclusion. So who do you follow? Well, on a lot of these things, they have equal authority. Now there are other ones where it would appear one opinion is stronger than the other. But generally, the madhabs, because of the human nature, each madhab will consider their opinion to be stronger than the other. That's human nature, and that's where you can get into stupidity. There's no doubt about that. That's where the madhabs can become like tribes or clans or gangs. You know, and that has happened historically, but that's a human problem. It's not a problem of the madhabs per se. That's just a human problem. So to blame that on the madhabs, as opposed to blaming on a human nature, is like claiming that religion is the cause of all wars. When in the 20th century, all the wars were fought over secularity. So man just needs a certain set of circumstances to find an excuse to go to war. So you can't blame war on any specific thing. You blame war on human nature. You don't blame war on, oh, he said that, that's why we went to war. That's not why you went to war. You know, we didn't go to war in Iraq for oil. But that's what people say. You know, we went to war in Iraq, this country did, there's human nature, greed, whatever the reasons are. But essentially, human nature is the problem. And that's why within the madhabs, human nature is the problem. So you can't blame the madhab for the problems that have arisen that involve the madhab. And that's why the uqala, the people of understanding, don't have that. So, you know, there was a time when certain scholars, and this is what, they use these arguments against madhab. There was a time when certain scholars in the Hanafi madhab said that you couldn't marry a Shafi'i woman. Right? The Hanafis couldn't marry. Why? Because they said, they're not certain about their faith, right? Or vice versa. The Shafi'is, they're not certain about their faith. And that happened. There's people that had that opinion. That's not a madhab problem. That wasn't Hanafis and Shafi'is. That was Maturidis and Ash'aris. Right? Because the Maturidis, to them, faith is a hal of a person, and with the Ash'aris, it's more of a maqam. In other words, the Maturidis believe that you can be a believer and then leave faith. Whereas the Ash'aris say no, faith is, even if you're in a state of disbelief, you're a believer with God. And that's why you can say, if somebody says, are you a believer? You say, I'm a believer, insha'Allah. Well, the Maturidis say that's doubt. You're doubting your faith. It's just semantics, because he's not doubting his faith. He's just doubting whether or not he'll die with that faith. He doesn't know. But the Maturidis say, no, you have to say you're a believer, and you know you're a believer, because if you have doubt in your faith, That's an example of mediocre ulama fighting over a semantic issue and creating problem. Is that a problem of Maturidis, Ash'aris? No, it's a problem of just excuses to fight. And that's why you can't take a lot of these things seriously. Personally, I can't take them seriously. I mean, most of this stuff is just human folly. And you have to be like the man in the, when you have a projector in the old days when I was growing up, in the movies, you had a man sitting in the back, you could see him, right, running the projector. Now it's all computerized, but in those days you had a man in the back, and he was always reading a book during the movie, right? He wasn't entertained, because he'd seen the movie so many times. And that, in essence, is what you have to get with human nature, is just like, this is a rerun. These are just reruns. They're uninteresting. So all this fighting and, oh, he's a bid'i and he's a... people have been doing this for 1400 years. At a certain point, you just have to see it as an uninteresting scenario. Like, I've seen this movie before, or I've read about it before. It's just not interesting. And people that get caught up in these things, it's what's in their hearts. It's because they're enjoying it. It's exciting, and, people get excited about fitna. And they get energy that they didn't have normally. Like, they don't have the energy to do good, but when it comes to fitna, they'll start staying up late at night and, writing their blogs and doing... It's just amazing the type of energy that people get. So, in terms of the madhabs, they formulated early. Imam Malik's madhab he does not consider himself the originator of the Maliki madhab. He sees himself as somebody in a tradition, and the tradition is the school of Medina. That's why Ibn Abd al-Barr calls his book the fiqh of Ahl al-Medina, the fiqh of the people of Medina. He doesn't call it Maliki fiqh, because Imam Malik is the central he is the central proponent of that school, but he is not the founder of the school, nor is he, nor does he see himself as that. So now, Imam Shafi'i radiallahu anhu is more the founder of his school, because his methodology and his approach, even though it was also, he's in the line of his teachers, but he broke with Imam Malik on certain issues. And Imam Shafi'i, who becomes mujtahid mutlaq, and it's not permissible for somebody like that to follow a teacher blindly. That he develops an usul, and he has certain opinions that are different from Imam Malik's opinion. Abu Hanifa radiallahu anhu was also in another school in Iraq. His teachers relied a lot on the intellect. They weren't Mu'tazilite in their approach, but they really recognized the central role of intellect in interpreting what's called naql, what's transmitted. And then Ahmad ibn Hanbal, who some of the early ulama did not consider him actually even to be an independent school, although the Hanbalis argue vociferously against that opinion. Many of the early people did not consider the Hanbali school to be a school of fiqh, because Imam Ahmad's central role was as a collector of hadith, and his musnad has over 30,000. He was a masterful collector of hadith. His fiqh opinions are very diverse. So, unlike the other schools, there are a lot of different opinions in the Hanbali madhab from the Imam himself. And so it's hard for the Hanbalis to actually determine what was the Imam's actual opinion on that subject. Imam Tabari, his house was attacked by Hanbalis because he said publicly that he did not consider the Hanbali school to be a school of fiqh. But it is a school of fiqh. It's the smallest of the four. And then you have another school called the Zahiri school from Abu Dawud al-Zahiri, who was a Persian faqih, and his school spreads in several places. he rejected qiyas, which is analogical reasoning, and his school spread, particularly in Andalusia, for a period of time, and then it died out in the 8th century, and hasn't. There have been attempts to revive it. There's people that are attracted to it today, a minority of people, but it's a dead madhab. Now, the reason why madhabs are living traditions is because they're handed down. You know, tradition is, traditare is what's handed down. And that is what naqal means, you know, anquluhu, like you transmit something to another person, you carry it. And the Prophet ﷺ indicated that in a hadith in which he said, sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, يحمل هذا الدين من كل قرن عدوله ينفون عنه تحريف الغالين وانتحال المبطلين وتأويل الجاهلين. That this knowledge will be carried, يحمل, right? It will be carried in every generation by upright people. You know, udul, people of adala. And the udul are people that they don't have any kaba'ir and they're not known to have constant saghair. That's the definition of adrun in hadith, is somebody who nobody has ever heard that he did any major wrong actions, and the minor wrong actions, there's nothing that he would do repeatedly. So he's not a backbiter. Even though backbiting, there's a khilaf. You know, some say it's a kabira, but kabira, the dominant opinion is it has a had punishment related to it if it doesn't have a had, with the exception of certain sins that were clarified, of being so enormous there wasn't a had punishment for it, like somebody who gives false testimony, things like that. Yamin ghamus, somebody who swears a false oath. So the udul are the people that carry this religion, and they transmit it. And the transmission does not mean that it is a dead thing. So when people say that, you know, you follow the Maliki madhab, and people say, oh, well, Malik didn't get everything right. You know, there were hadiths he didn't know. This is an argument that you hear. They say, oh, there's hadith he didn't know. First of all, the likelihood of those 4 men not knowing all of the hadith that relate to actual ahkam is highly unlikely. Because one, there were not a lot of hadith that relate to ahkam. 2, these were very vibrant intellectual societies, and there were scholars who were teaching. Imam Malik had over 600 scholars from the Tabi'een in the city of Medina. So the likelihood of him not coming across hadiths that related to ahkam is just highly unlikely. Imam Shafi'i studied with Imam Malik. Imam Abu Hanifa knew Imam Malik. He knew his opinions. Imam Malik knew the opinions of Abu Hanifa. I mean, literally, he knew what his opinions were. So that idea is not a strong idea. But even if, granted, they didn't know. Let's say they didn't know. Maybe they didn't know 10, 20%. Even Imam Malik refused to allow Mansur, Abu Ja'far, to force his opinions on the ummah, because he said the Sahaba spread out and there's hadiths maybe they didn't reach us, and people also are following what they're used to, and you shouldn't impose foreign opinions on people that are following something they were used to. So Imam Malik rejected the idea of having his madhab become the madhab of all of the community. But Imam Malik radiallahu anhu, his madhab was a madhab of hadith. I mean, he has opinion, but he was a madhab of athar and of hadith. And so he knew all of these hadiths, but, and this is the important thing to remember, the madhab of Imam Malik is a collected, it is a corpus of knowledge that has been collected, has been codified, and has been reviewed over and over again for centuries. There's still Maliki scholars, and Sheikh Abdullah bin Bay is an example of that, that are examining the source material and coming to their own conclusions. So the madhabs, these four madhabs, have never been static. They've never been, when you say you follow the Maliki madhab, it doesn't mean you follow Malik on every opinion. There are opinions in his madhab that go against what his opinion was. There are opinions in the Hanafi madhab that go against the opinion of Abu Hanifa. There are opinions in the Shafi'i madhab that go against the opinion of Imam Shafi'i, because their followers followed their methodology and said, well, according to his methodology, this is a stronger proof. There are also followers in the Maliki madhab that differed with Imam Malik about certain points that he made. So even though they're Maliki, they don't necessarily agree with all the conclusions that Imam Malik came to about certain things. So, but what emerges is what's called two principles. There's three words that you should know: mashhur, rajih, and da'if. Mashhur is what the majority of the Maliki scholars, and these are the mujtahidun, either mujtahidun muqayyadun, mujtahidun, there's different types of ijtihad in the madhab, but they are the mujtahidun of the madhab, and it is when the majority of them argue a point, it's called mashhur in the madhab. It's called mashhur. And that is what, if you are a muqallid, if you're somebody who hasn't achieved a level of ijtihad, it's what the madhab demands that you follow, unless you have within the madhab certain conditions or circumstances that enable you to go to a different opinion, and that's done by a mufti within the madhab who can determine that for you. The second is called the rajih. The rajih is the preponderant opinion, so it's ma qawiyya daliluhu. It's where there's a stronger proof. Most of the ulama of the madhab they kind of reject that distinction. But there are muhaqqiqun in the madhab, great scholars in the madhab, that will argue that even though this is the dominant opinion, the proof is against them. They will argue that. And there are some people that take that and there are some people that don't. So you'll find that. But it's a strong opinion. There's no doubt. And the qabl and the sadal are examples of that, and I'll go into that when I get it. But there are those that argue that the qabl is the rajih, the sadal is the marjuh, but the sadal is mashhur. The sadal is the dominant opinion. Well, the people of mashhur would argue that the mashhur is the rajih. So you know, and generally that's what they will argue, that this is the rajih, is the mashhur, that they're synonymous. But in the books there's a clear distinction, although sometimes they are used in shuruh synonymously. So, and that's why these books, if you don't study them with teachers, they're really complicated. They really are. If you haven't, especially the technical terminology and especially masters, I mean, it's the best is to take from the masters, but you know, it's tayammum suffices when you don't have water. So now just a few things about the madhab. Imam Malik was born outside of Medina, near Khaybar, but he grew up, he spent his entire life in Medina. His father was from Dhu Asbah, which is a Yemeni tribe. They were actually kings of Yemen. Some people claim that he was from the Mawali of Dhu Asbah, but he rejected it, and his grandfather clearly states that they were from Dhu Asbah. And الناس مؤمنون على أنسابهم. People should be trusted about their ansab. الطعن في الأنساب is fisq. To challenge people's lineage is fisq in the deen. You should not challenge people's lineage unless there's a clear proof. Somebody's claiming something and it's clearly fabricated. But otherwise, if it's something where people, you know, it's just opinions, you believe the people about their lineage. His mother, Aliyah, was a Taymiyah, so he's related to Abu Bakr as-Siddiq through his maternal side of the family. They're Siddiqiyun. And he was very, very brilliant early on, but his mother should be credited with a lot of Imam Malik's tawfiq. She used to, when he was a little boy, she used to wrap him in a turban. She would actually tie his turban and send him to his teachers. And when she sent him to Ibn Hormuz, she said, take from his patience before you take from his knowledge. So she understood that part of the purpose of studying was not just information, it was actually about character. That's a very important point. And he had brilliant teachers. Rabi'a was one of his teachers, Ibn Hormuz, Zuhri. He was beloved by his teachers. He also, one of the unique things about Malik is most of his teachers became his students, even his great teachers. Most of his teachers ended up actually taking from him. And by the time he was 17, he was giving fatwa. And he said, I only gave fatwa after being permitted to do so by 40, and in a riwayah 70, muhannak, people that wore the ulama used to wear the turban with a part of the turban under the neck. It's called tahniq. You see it in the Sahara Desert. They still do that. Most places they don't. But the ulama of Medina did that. And he said, I only gave fatwa after 40 of the muhannakun. The ulama of Medina considered me to be worthy of giving fatwa. And he gave fatwa until he was almost 90 years old. So Imam Malik's opinions change over time, and that is why you will find different opinions throughout his history, because he was learning in knowledge, and as you increase in knowledge, you change your views about things. He was blessed at having a very long life. They said about Imam Shafi'i that it was fortunate for the other madhabs that he didn't have a long life, because had he had a long life, there wouldn't be other madhabs left. You know, he was so brilliant. He died when he was 54 years old. And his madhab, interestingly enough, because of Imam Nawawi, has very little diverse opinion. The Hanafi and the Maliki madhabs have a lot of diverse opinions. They were also ruling madhabs. Both the Hanafi and the Maliki madhab have had the most number of states that their madhabs actually were the legal mechanism of the state. And for that reason, because of the nature of running a state, you have a lot of diverse opinions in the madhabs. The Hanbali madhab, the current Saudi Arabia, thank you. Saudi Arabia is the first real Hanbali dawla. They really haven't had a dawla before that. And the Shafi'i, obviously Yemen and southern India and a few other places, they've had power also. But the Malikis had all of Africa, and for a period of time, Imam Malik's madhab was the madhab of the Arabian Peninsula, including the Najd. Najd used to be Maliki. The eastern part of Arabia was all Maliki. Bahrain was Maliki. The Emirates now is still Maliki. Qatar is part Maliki, part Hanbali. Kuwait is officially Maliki because that was originally Maliki. There was a large portion of Malikis in Iraq before the Abbasid Caliph, because the Hanafi madhab became the official madhab of the state. So a lot of people switched to the Hanafi madhab. And you will see there was a study done at Harvard that showed that during the early period, the Maliki madhab was the dominant madhab, but because of state power, people began to convert to the Hanafi madhab to get jobs. And that's why you will find in the books of fiqh that they prohibit converting to another madhab to get a job, because that was obviously something that happened at the time. But his madhab was in Khurasan also. It was in India. There were Malikis in India. There were Malikis in Iran. And that became Hanafi land, and the Maliki madhab died out. And then it moved west into Andalusia. And the great Maliki countries are really Egypt, which is the dominant Maliki school. Now it's limited to the Sa'id. But in the early period, the great Maliki scholars were from Egypt proper, down in Alexandria and in Al-Qahira. So the Maliki school, the dominant opinion of the school is the Egyptian school. And after that, you'll have the Moroccans have strong opinions, the Tunisians and the Andalusians, and the Iraqis also. But generally, when we say the mashhur of the madhab, we're talking about the Egyptian school. Yeah, there is. I mean, the Sahnun, Imam Sahnun, there's 4 major books in the Maliki madhab, the Wadiha, the Utbiya, the Mudawwana, Al-Wadiha, Wal-Mawaziyah. Those are the 4 major. Al-Asadiyya becomes the Mudawwana. The Asadiyya was Asad ibn al-Furat, was a qadi who studied with Imam Malik, and he wrote a book which has Malik's opinions called the Asadiyya. Imam Sahnun took the Asadiyya and revised it and corrected things. And then he showed it to Ibn al-Qasim, who was very happy with it. And when Asad ibn al-Furat was shown the book, he said, why do you need that when you have my book? And the Malikis generally, even though he was a great man, they generally say that that's the reason why he just didn't get the tawfiq that Imam Sahnun did. Because, and it's a very human thing to do. He obviously put a lot of work in his book, and it's always depressing when somebody outdoes you at something that you've put a lot of work into. So that happened, and but the Mudawwana of Imam Sahnun is the book now that the madhab relies on. That book is been printed in 4 or 5 volumes. It used to be memorized. So the last person that I know that memorized, not personally, but I know of, that memorized it was Ibn Khaldun. Ibn Khaldun was the qadi of the Malikis in Egypt in the 14th century, but it's important to note, even though he memorized the whole Mudawwana, he wasn't considered a major player in the Maliki madhab. He doesn't have an opinion in the books of the Malikis. So that shows you that rote memorization was, even though he was a genius also, but rote memorization and knowing the madhab did not mean that you necessarily had an opinion in the madhab. So now the Mudawwana then is abridged into the Tahdhib of al-Baradi'i, and that becomes the dominant book that's used. And then that was abridged again by Ibn Habib, and then Khalil ibn Ishaq abridges that book. And the abridgment of Khalil ibn Ishaq, for some reason or another, becomes the dominant book of the madhab. He abridges it, and it just, that's what everybody in the Maliki school started studying after him. And he was an Egyptian, and then his book was abridged by another scholar, Abu Barakat al-Dardir, and this is the first volume of that abridgment and his commentary on it. But he abridged the Aqrab al-Masalik, which is written 200 years ago. So the madhab becomes abridgments of abridgments of abridgments. Now Ibn Ashir, who was a student of, not a direct student, but he was a master of Khalil, and he taught Khalil. Ibn Ashir took the mashhur in the 5 pillars, and he abridged this book. And this book is usually the second book that people in the madhab study now. If you're in the Eastern world, they study the Ashmawiyah, which is an Egyptian Sudanese text. If you're in the Africa west of Sudan, you study Al-Akhdari as a first text, generally. And then Ibn Ashir as a second text. The Risala of Ibn Abi Zayd, sometimes the Izziyah, depends on where you are. The Risala as a third intermediate text, which is similar to Sheikh Nuh's Shafi'i text of the Reliance of the Traveler. The Risala is an intermediate text in fiqh, written by Ibn Abi Zayd al-Qayrawani, who was a brilliant 4th century Maliki scholar who was known as the Little Malik. because of his knowledge of the madhab. And then the final book that's studied today is Khalil, generally. And then if you go into Qada, they study the Tuhfa of Ibn al-Asim, Tuhfat al-Ahkam. So that's the madhab today. But the primary sources and people that master those basic sources, that go on to, like somebody like Sheikh Abdullah bin Bayya, who becomes a master jurist, will study the Ummahats. When you study the Ummahats, you get into vast diversity of opinion. I mean, even in these books, when you study the commentary, you see how much diversity of opinion. The Sharia is very flexible. The Sharia, fiqh also technically is not Sharia. I mean, Sharia is the hukum of God. The fiqh is the understanding of the hukum. So Allah says something, and then how people understand it is what becomes fiqh. That's why the Prophet ﷺ said, "Man yuridillahu bihi khayran yufaqihu fid din." The one that God wants good for, He will give him understanding of the deen. So the deen is the sharia. But having understanding of that is another thing. So some people have good understanding, some people have mediocre understanding, some people have poor understanding. And you'll find all of that in the permutations of the fuqaha. You have ridiculous opinions that show up, and you'll read them and you'll say, that is completely insane. But it's an opinion, and it's mentioned in the books. And then you will have brilliant, just amazing opinions that you can't believe, how did he think of that? How did they derive that ruling? So you're going to get that whole spectrum of opinion. And then the tarjih is the ability to choose the best. الَّذِينَ يَسْتَمِعُونَ الْقَوْلَ فَيَتَّبِعُونَ أَحْسَنَ. Those who listen to things and they follow the best of it. And that's basically what the madhabs have done. It's tahdhib. They have, over the time, chosen what they believe to be the best understandings from all of these great scholars that lived, and their opinions become codified, and they become the madhab. So it's important to note that even though we believe these are ahkam, and we believe that they fall under the categories, it's still human understanding. And the early community did not say halal and haram with fiqh. That becomes a later the later ulama used those terms in fiqh. The early community did not. Imam Malik did not use halal and haram. Unless he had a nas sarih that something was haram, he didn't say halal or haram. They used to ask him questions, he'd say, la yu'jibuni, I don't like that. Or akrahu dhalika. Or ma kana alayhi an-nas. People didn't used to do that. Or la yaf'aluhu illa al-fusaq. Only bad people do that. That's the extent. He would not actually say that's halal or haram, because it was such an enormity to do that. أَتَفْتَرُونَ عَلَى اللَّهِ الْكَذِبَ. تَصِفُوا أَلْسِنَتكُمْ الْكَذِبَ هَذَا حَلَالٌ وَهَذَا حَرَامٌ. لِتَفْتَرُوا عَلَى اللَّهِ الْكَذِبَ. You describe with your tongues lies, saying this is halal and this is haram. And you're lying about God, because if God didn't say it, you have no authority to say it. The later ulama, and part of the reason for this, it's understandable, and we have to live with it, but part of the reason for this is because in the early period, people were very educated, and there was a high level of sophistication in the community. As time went, and they were also aware of all the diversity of opinion, but as time passed, and these madhabs began to be geographical, so you were living in a place where it was all Malikis, well, you don't want to tell people, in the opinion of Imam Malik, the hukum is this. Oh, you mean there's another opinion? And it creates confusion in common people, because the ulama just want to tell them, look, here's the hukum, because they're asking, what does God say about this? Well, if I have to explain to you, this isn't really what God says, but this is what we think God says about this situation. For people that, common people, they're going to get confused. And so the ulama chose to go that route of saying, this is the hukum. It's haram to do that. Even though it might be haram only in your madhab. Now, unfortunately or fortunately, we're not Times have changed. You know, there's a lot more literacy. There's people that can read for themselves. You can Google now. And I don't say that facetiously. I mean, people can look up, amazing what, look up rulings online and there's some really accurate information. There's also inaccurate information. There's a lot of nutty stuff. But people are, generally, it's a little harder to get them to swallow that pill or to drink the Kool-Aid of the madhab these days. But this is our deen. And this is if you take it away, you unravel something very precious, and you'll find yourself naked and shivering in the cold without it. So this idea of just disregarding this stuff is insanity as far as I'm concerned. On the other hand, the idea of taking this as written in stone, which to me is traditionalism. It's not tradition, it's traditionalism. To take this stuff as written in stone is also dangerous, and you can't do that to people, because humans, by the very nature of life on earth, need flexibility, and that's why the usul is there for adaptation and for the ability to be flexible. And so you cannot try to impose a body of work on people without recognizing that conditions sometimes necessitate that you find dispensations for people. Now, the way of the real fuqaha is that they tend to be hard on themselves and easy on other people. And the way of the munafiqun of these traditions is that they're easy on themselves and hard on everybody else. So, and then there's some people that are hard on themselves and hard on everybody else. But the faqih, his role is to be, Ibn Uyayna said, al-fiqhu rukhsatun an thiqa. Fiqh is taking a dispensation of leniency from a trustworthy source. أما التشديد فيحسنه كل أحد. As for being hard and rigid in your opinions, everybody's good at that. Anybody can say it's haram. Anybody can, but real fiqh is facilitating people's affairs. Yuridukum Allah al-yusr. Allah wants ease for you, So that's, is there any questions about any of this that I've gone over? That's certainly a modern view. I mean, traditionally people, in the history of Islam, you won't find any alim of any weight or worth in the last 1100 years that did not have one of the madhabs after his name. Imam Nawawi al-Shafi'i, Imam al-Qurtubi al-Maliki, Qadi Iyad al-Maliki, Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani al-Shafi'i, Imam al-Tahawi al-Hanafi. I mean, they all followed the madhab. So that has been the tradition. Now, I once asked one of my teachers about a saying that's common, madhabul ammi man yuftihi. The madhab of common people is whoever gives them fatwa. And he said, هذا صحيح من جانب وباطل من جانب آخر. It's sound from one perspective, it's false from another. It's sound in that if you really don't know anything, then if you go to an authority, you just take what they give you. It doesn't matter what it is. But he said it's not sound in that you should learn your deen. And the way that you learn your deen is through these texts. If you want to reinvent the wheel, it's very hard to do that. I mean, if you say, like, I'm going to follow Salat al-Nabi ka'annaka tarahu, the prayer of the Prophet as if you see it, which was written by an Albanian Syrian scholar, Nasiruddin al-Albani, wrote a book called The Prayer of the Prophet as if you see it. Now, the idea there is somehow that Imam Malik's prayer was not the prayer of the Prophet, or Imam Hanafi's prayer was not the prayer. But Imam Malik, one of his primary teachers was Nafi', who was the freed slave of Ibn Umar. And Ibn Umar, of all of the Sahaba, is noted to follow the Sunnah more than any other Sahabi. So if Malik's primary teacher took directly from Ibn Umar, who saw the Prophet pray, didn't Malik know how the Prophet prayed? I mean, So if you're going to follow Nasiruddin al-Albani, what you have to understand is you're following his tarjihat. He's picking for you the hadiths that he thinks are the soundest hadith. So you're really following Nasiruddin al-Albani. You're not following the Prophet ﷺ. You're following him in that he's taking from the hadith, but you're taking from his understanding. When you take from this, you're taking from thousands of ulama of a school that happens to be named after the man that codified the methodology used to do those tarjihat, to interpret the hadith. Because each of the schools has their interpretive hermeneutic, their means by which they interpret. So you can say that, and the madhabs can be a source of separation. There's no doubt about that. And the idea of and there's some people that do say that, I just want to be a Muslim. And that's true, and we are ultimately all, that's what we are. Whether we're in the Hanafi class right now or the Maliki class, we're all Muslim. Imam Zayd's one of my closest friends, and he's Shafi'i. It never even comes up. We never even discuss. He might ask me, or I might ask him on occasion, what's the Shafi'i opinion about something, or what's the Maliki opinion. But it's just not an issue. And that's what I was saying. You have to be like the man in the projection room. You can't take the melodrama that people make of this stuff seriously. But I will say there is an opinion, and it is a valid opinion, of what's called talfiq, which is to choose from the different madhabs. You can take different opinions. The ulama stipulate that you not take the easy opinions of the madhabs, because your religion will disappear. In the Hanafi madhab, a woman can marry herself without a wali. In the Maliki madhab, you don't need shuhud for a marriage contract to be valid. What's that? Yeah. No, Malik has dowry, but there is a madhab. I don't know if it's either the Hanafi or the Hanbali. The dowry doesn't have to be any material thing. You can give a dowry of something like teach them ikhlas, for instance. So in the end, you can have a marriage without marriage if you took from each of the opinions. There's an opinion, that ice does not break the fast in Ramadan. You can find just crazy opinions. One man actually put all the rukhas into one book and brought it to the caliph, and the caliph had him imprisoned. Because he said, you're going to destroy the religion. So, but there's times to follow simple, easier views. If there's real hardship, there's times to follow that. So, there's times if you're a Hanafi and you're going to go on an airplane and, to follow the Shafi'i opinion of joining the prayers in certain situations is reasonable. Because the Hanafis don't join the prayer. But in modern travel, sometimes it becomes very difficult. So to go to another madhab to facilitate that, given that they're both valid opinions. It's not the hukm of Allah that you can't join the prayer. It's the hukm of the Hanafi madhab. Now they will say that's the hukm of Allah in their madhab, but that gets back to what I was telling you before. It's their understanding of the hukm of Allah. So, I would argue that, and this is, I'm not arguing, but this is what I was taught, and it makes sense to me, that you should study a madhab in your basic deen, because you need to fast, and you need rules of fasting, and the madhab provides those rules in a very intelligent, systematic way. And you need to pay your zakat. Now there's differences of opinion in the madhabs about these things, and I think I covered very briefly why those differences exist, because of language, because of interpretation. It's not because they didn't know the dalils. Trust me, that argument is absolutely, it's a false argument that some people put forward, but it is not true. These madhabs have looked at the other madhabs, they know the dalils of the other madhabs, the great ulama knew the opinions of the other schools, and sometimes they actually said, you know what, that opinion makes more sense. So you will find Maliki scholars like Imam al-Lakhmi, who preferred the Shafi'i opinion on certain things. In the Hanafi madhab, if they don't find a valid opinion in their madhab, it's actually in their usul to go to the Maliki madhab and take what the Malikis say. So even within the madhabs, there is a respect of the other madhabs, but they draw different conclusions based on their methodologies. Yes. Hanafi without a wali. No, in Malik, you can, the aqd is valid without the shuhud. There has to be shuhud at a certain point, but the aqd takes place. If the wali does it, then you need to inform. Well, you see, that's the point. If she's a Hanafi, then she could follow that. But if she's not a Hanafi, then it becomes dangerous, because you can the Prophet said, "La nikah liman la waliya lah." You know, there's no nikah for the one that doesn't have a wali. Abu Hanifa understood that to refer to the mushbara, the girl that was still in a state of ijbar. So, in his opinion, if she'd already married, then she could remarry, or if she had إِذَا بَلَغَتْ, you know, if she got to sin al-rushd where you gave her money and she was safe with her money, then that was his opinion. But that's an opinion. No, there's no wizard. Why would there be wizard? I mean, it's a valid opinion. Well, and then khuruj an al-khilaf is mustahab. To get out of khilaf is mustahab. So the Hanafis don't encourage that. It's an opinion, and it's a valid opinion, but they don't encourage that. You know, in normal circumstances, there should be a wali. In certain excruciating circumstances, then it would be a permissible thing for a woman to do. But generally, she should have a wali. Well, the Prophet ﷺ had dispensation. He didn't need even witnesses, anything. The Prophet had his dispensations in marriage. One woman, his marriage was just to put his cloak around her. You know, so the Prophet ﷺ, I mean, his practice, his personal practice can't be taken as a means of what we're able to do. Yeah. I mean, the Prophet had dispensations about it. He had dispensations that facilitated his work, but he had dispensations that made it harder too. I mean, the Prophet's, it's not all, I mean, people that think that the Prophet ﷺ, somehow those marriages were like perks or something like that, they were a great burden on him, the marriages. They were not easy. I mean, he had a very difficult time. He had 9 very strong women, and it wasn't easy. And his house often had a lot of difficulty going on. So, but he did what he did, and he did it all based on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's permission for him to do what he did. But, I mean, I wouldn't encourage somebody to marry without a wali, personally, Yeah. I mean, I think there's a reason why we have that in our religion. And women can be abused very easily, especially if they don't know the man, because you're getting into something that you don't know. You're in love, your father doesn't want you to marry, but you want to marry, and then you end up marrying, but then the marriage could turn into a disaster. I mean, that's very real. And then the wilaya is to protect the woman. The wilaya is there. The wali is the guardian of the woman. And the idea is that in marriages, the woman's in a compromised situation because of the nature of marriage. Money is in the hands of the husband generally, not always, and it's certainly changing in our time. And that's why a lot of these rules need to be re-examined. I would agree with that in light of modern society. I think there's a lot of situations where women are put into problematic situations. For adult women, I mean, I tend to incline towards the Hanafi position personally, because I've seen situations where parents will not let the girl get married, and it has to do with really stupid things, because it's not their cousin, or because they're not a doctor, or because I've seen that in many situations. On the other hand, you don't want to destroy a family, over trying to create another family. So tabni usra wa tahdim usra ukhra. It's kind of a crazy thing to do. Mm-hmm.
Studying a text with the Shaykh, like
Yeah, no, I would teach if you've done the Bab and your family needs to learn that, then by all means teach it, you know. And if you have questions, then you have to ask. I mean, the Prophet Imam Malik radiallahu anhu was asked 40 questions by some people who came from Iraq, and on 36 of them he said, "I don't know, la adri," and they were hard questions. And the man just said to him, he said, "We came all the way from Iraq to the alim of Medina," because that's what they used to call him. "And what do we tell the people when we go back to Iraq?" And he said, "Tell them that you met the alim of Medina," and he said he didn't know. So, you know, that just being able to say, "I don't know," or "let me check," or, you know, I mean, the people I studied with memorized everything, you know. I don't have that capacity, but those are people I studied with. So it's a lot better to study with somebody like that. But like I said, you know, absence of water, you use tayammum. Yeah. Well, I mean, in America, I think we're a little freer because we don't have the geography of madhab. Like if you're in Pakistan, I wouldn't encourage following the Maliki madhab, because a lot of people in Pakistan are very provincial. And that's true of any area where you have lower levels of education. You go to Egypt. Egypt's very cosmopolitan, so it's a little different. And they've known the madhabs for a long time. But in Pakistan, no. I mean, you know, if you go to Afghanistan and pray a certain way, they don't think your prayer is valid because they've never seen anybody pray like that. Do you see? Yeah. You know what you get when you mix a Shia and a Sunni? Huh? Sushi. Yeah. You know, I would definitely, given the choice, because I studied both the Shia. I mean, I didn't study Shia in depth, but I studied it enough to know. Because for me, you know, I became Muslim. I wasn't born a Muslim, and I wasn't born into a Muslim family. And what interests me is the truth. I'm not interested in rah, you know, this is my ancestors. And so I don't, you know, if the Shia thing appeared to me to be stronger, I would have been a Shia. And during the Iranian Revolution, when I first became Muslim, I got very interested in Tashayyu', like a lot of people, because there was a lot of fervor and things. But And I believe that the Shia narrative is an alternative narrative. In other words, within the Shia tradition, it makes perfect sense. And that's why it's very hard to convince a Shia of the Sunni positions about things, because within their narrative, they have all their proofs. And that's why the problem's insoluble. It's just not going to be solved. And it's best to leave it alone. I'm totally against like debates and, you know, but for me, the Sunni position differs on one central thing that makes sense to me, and that is about having a good opinion, husn al-dhann, you know, and that's where I feel most comfortable, because the Sahaba made major mistakes. There's no doubt about that. I mean, Muawiyah, you read some of these stories, and it's very clear. And the Sunnis have covered up a lot of this stuff and kind of pretended like it really didn't happen. But if you get into the history of even our scholars, like Imam Tabari, and you read some of this stuff, it's just hard to believe. It's hard to swallow what happened. But in the end of the day, the Sunni position is husn al-dhann. You know, these people were going to have, that their intentions were not malevolent. You know, they were humans. They were behaving like humans, but their intentions were not malevolent. Whereas in the Sunni tradition, they attack the intentions. And that's the real problem for me about them. But if I was coming from that, I mean, I would look at the different schools. I would read like Imam Jibril Haddad's book called The Four Madhabs. And, you know, decide for yourself. I mean, I'm happy with the Maliki madhab. In ibadat, to me, it's the strongest madhab. I believe that. And I don't believe that out of ta'assub, because there are positions in the other madhabs that I prefer. But in ibadat, I don't see there's any stronger madhab, because if you study the methodology of Malik, it just makes sense that his ibadat are the strongest. I mean, the famous story of when they debated about how much was the sa'. You know, one of the Hanafi scholars disagreed with Imam Malik, and the governor in Medina was there, and they were discussing this issue. And Imam Malik just said to somebody, go get so-and-so and tell him to bring his sa'. And so he went and he brought the sa', you know. And he said, where did you get that from? He said, I inherited it from my father. And he said, where did he get it from? He said, he inherited from... And he mentioned one of the Sahaba. So, I mean, he actually had the sa'a of a Sahabi. And Imam Malik said, I don't really care what the opinions of the Iraqis are. I mean, this is what the Sahaba were measuring their sa'a with, and that's what we measure our sa'a with. Somebody once asked him about the adhan in Medina, because in Medina you do Allahu Akbar 2 times, only 2 times, not 4. And then Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah, Ashhadu Muhammad Rasulullah, Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah, Ashhadu Muhammad Rasulullah, Ashhadu Muhammad. And then you do a tarji', you go back and say Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah, Ashhadu. So you do the shahada 4 times. So they asked Imam Malik about Mecca. He said, I don't care what they do in Mecca. You know, this is what we found the Tabi'een doing, and they found the Sahaba doing, and there were 10,000 of them that died in Medina. So Imam Malik's position about the adhan is, look, this is what they were doing when the Prophet was alive, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and this is the place he died. In other words, the last practice that he was on is in this place. And so that was his view of things, and to me, it makes a lot of sense. Following the ahadith, there's a lot of contradictory hadiths about that, so, about different things. So, I mean, I have, you know, when we get to sadal, the sadal is not a weak position, you know, leaving the hands at the side. There are very strong proofs for sadal, even though people attack it and is out of ignorance. But if you actually study the dalils for sadal, they're very, very strong, as far as I'm concerned. So, in ibadat, it's a very strong madhab. You know, in the mu'amalat, the Hanafi madhab has a lot of sa'a that is very appealing, especially to modern people. I mean, there's certain things in the Hanafi madhab that I prefer. You know, Imam Abu Hanifa had musawat between Muslims and non-Muslims in Diya and in Qatl and things, and that makes more sense to me. But I'm a modern person, you know, equality and those things. I was brainwashed with that stuff, so. That makes more sense than this idea that if a non-Muslim kills a Muslim, he's killed, but if a Muslim kills a non-Muslim, he's not killed. It doesn't make sense to me. Well, I mean, I think for us, the majority, what we have to focus on more is ibadat. The hukm of Islam has been gone for a long time, and it's not coming back. You know, it's just not. And it's a illusion for people to believe that, because the hadiths are very clear that Islam yurfa, you know, Islam gets taken away from people. The Prophet ﷺ said, لَا يَنْقَضِيَنَّ عُرُلَ الْإِسْلَامِ عُرْوَةً عُرْوَةً. The Islam is going to go knot by knot, you know, like a rope that you go up to the heaven. It'll go knot by knot. And he said, كُلُّ مَا تَنْقَضِي عُرْوَةٌ يَتَشَبَّثَ النَّاسِ بِالَّتِي تَلِيهَا. Every time one knot goes, people cling to the one that follows it, holding on to the rope of Islam. And so you're up at the top, but the ropes, the knots start going, and you're descending, so you get lower and lower. It's a beautiful metaphor. And then he said, فَأَوَّلُهَا نَقْضًا الْحُكْمُ. You know, the first thing that goes is governance. وَأَخِرُهَا الصَّلَاةِ. And the last thing to go is the prayer. So, we still have a reasonable amount of the deen, but we should be focusing on what we have, not what we've lost. And it doesn't mean you don't learn the rules and things like that of what we've lost, but to obsess about those things and not recognize the primacy of what we have is, I think, foolish. Now, in terms of family law and things like that, I agree. I mean, I think there's a lot of pre-modern things in the books of fiqh that are very problematic today. And that's when you need people of ijtihad. I mean, Sheikh Abdullah bin Bayya, who I trust a lot, you know, Ijbar is part of the Sharia. Like a father can impose marriage on the son or the daughter, right? And they can even marry them when they're babies, legally. So, but he says Ijbar is inappropriate in the West. and I agree, and I think increasingly it's inappropriate in the Muslim countries because, women's status has changed considerably, and arranged marriages, which tended to work in very primitive societies and pre-modern societies, they tended to work, and there are many people who have their grandmothers were in, seriously, just ask people, most people's grandmothers were in arranged marriages, and the marriage worked out. Maybe it didn't work out all the time, but generally it worked out. But now it's very hard for a woman, like, what, you're going to tell me who I'm going to marry? It's hard for modern women to even swallow that idea. But it's in the books of fiqh, so how do we deal with that, And that's a case where I would say you go back to the spirit of the Sharia and the fact that the Prophet ﷺ, the woman that came to the Prophet and said, my father wants me to marry this man and I don't want to marry him, and who's right? And he said, you're right. And then she said, okay. And then she said, well, I'm going to marry him anyway. And she said, I just wanted the women to see that we have rights here. So her whole point was she was fine with the marriage, but she just wanted to assert the fact that she didn't have to marry somebody she didn't want to marry. And that's a sound hadith. And to me, that is more in line with the spirit of the law. So I think the ijbar aspect, which is in the madhab, I'm not going to say it's not a valid opinion. It's the mashhur of the madhab. But for my own daughter, I wouldn't practice that personally. Does that make sense? Oh. Are you all right? Are you okay? Alhamdulillah. Yeah. I'm glad it didn't fall on me. Then I would have thought it was a sign for disagreeing with Ishbar. Anyway, any other questions? Uh-huh. There's no hadiths that are mawdu' that they used. Imam Malik took mursal. He accepted marasil. And what's interesting about Imam Malik's marasil is they've all been proven to be marfu'. Every single hadith that he took that was mursal has been proven to be marfu' by his school. So it's not really an issue anymore. Imam Shafi'i only took mursal from Ibn Musayyib, So these are khilaf issues. Ahmad ibn Hanbal didn't take the mursal. No, he took the mursal. So, but generally the hadiths that they took were, they've been proven to be marfu'. Because the marasil of Sa'id ibn Musayyib and Ikrimah and other, of the early scholars, they were thiqat. One of the things Sahaba, people say, Abu Huraira relates almost 3,000 hadiths and he was only with the Prophet for less than 2 years. How's that possible? And Abu Huraira didn't just take hadith from the Prophet ﷺ. He took hadith from other Sahaba. That was his job. He was a hadith collector. And so he took hadith from other Sahaba, but he didn't mention them. That's why sometimes he'll say, I heard the Prophet say, other times he'll say, the Prophet said, and he won't say, I heard the Prophet, because he didn't hear it from the Prophet ﷺ, he heard it from another Sahaba. But the Sahaba are all udul, so they don't have to mention, if they heard it from another Sahabi, that I heard it from, Amr ibn al-As or something. No, they don't have to say that. Because if Amr ibn al-As said it, he's trustworthy in his statement of the Sahaba. One of the hadiths the Prophet repeated more than any other hadith was, "Man kadhaba alayya muta'ammidan falyatabawwa maq'adahu min an-nar." Whoever lies about me intentionally, he should take his seat in hell. He mentioned that hadith more than any other hadith. It's mutawatir with dozens of riwayat in each generation. So the Prophet made it very clear, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, that to lie about him, you were going to hell. And that's why Sahaba didn't do that. There's mawdu'at in the literature. I mean, there's no doubt about that. And then there's mawdu'at that they'll mention after it, like Allahumma salli ala Sayyidina Muhammad. I mean, I'll give you an example. Man arafa nafsahu faqad arafa rabbuhu. Whoever knows his self knows his Lord. That is related as a hadith and is quoted in a lot of the books, especially the people of tasawwuf. And some of the ulama wrote books on that one hadith. That hadith generally is a statement of Yahya ibn Ma'in. I mean, that's where it comes from. But Ibn Arabi, who wrote a text on it, Ibn Hajar and others considered him from the Huffaz. I mean, he was considered a hafiz of hadith. Generally, when the Huffaz mention a hadith, they have some basis for it. And that's why, like Imam al-Ghazali was not a muhaddith. So if he mentions a hadith, it's not of the same caliber as somebody like Ibn Abdul Barr. Ibn Abdul Barr mentions a hadith in his Jami' al-Ilm. He mentions the hadith, اطلب العلم ولو في الصين, seek knowledge even unto China. Now that hadith, a lot of people said it's a fabricated hadith. Ibn Abdul Barr, the fact that he mentions that hadith, وَلَا يُعَلَّقْ عَلَيْهِ, and he mentions it as a hadith, gives it weight. So there's hadiths that are given weight by the person that narrates the hadith, whether or not he gives you the chain or not. If he doesn't, إِذَا لَمْ يُعَلَّقْ عَلَيْهِ, if he doesn't say فِيهِ نَظَرْ or قِيلَ or رُوِيَ, or gives you some kind of what they call صِغَةُ الضُّعْف. So, but generally, like I said, these madhabs have been so worked. I mean, they've just been plowed by the ulama. So you're not going to find fabricated hadiths, them basing ahkam on fabricated hadith. And one of the beauties of the madhab is the people of taqwa are the ones that, there's fabricated hadiths about sadal. Qadi Iyad mentions them in the Tartib al-Madarik. And he says, this man was obviously trying to support his madhab and having a good opinion of his imams, but this isn't the way you prove your point, by fabricating a hadith. So they rejected the hadith. I mean, it would have been very convenient just to bring a hadith about khalq al-Quran for when they were arguing that the mushaf was makhluq. But every time they tried to, the muhaddithun would say it's a false hadith. Even if they were Mu'tazilite, because taqwa necessitates rejecting something that's false, even if it supports your opinion. And that's the way the ulama were. They were very, very adamant about that. And that's why it's amazing that you don't find these, the traditions filled with false hadith to support their opinions. It'd be nice if they could just buttress up their opinions with the hadith. I mean, it wouldn't be nice, but I'm saying, if the religion wasn't based on that, it would have been very easy to do that. But they didn't do that. They were very rigorous about what they allowed to get through, even if it didn't support their position. And that's why you have hadiths that are mentioned by the Malikis. Like, for instance, Imam Malik considered the Fajr to be Salat al-Wusta, right? The hadith in al-Bukhari states that it's Asr. And Imam Malik knew that hadith. But he preferred the opinion of Ibn Abbas and of Imam Ali, because he's saying Ibn Abbas was tarjuman al-Quran. He's the interpreter of the Quran. قُومُوا لِلَّهِ قَانِتِينَ حَافِظُوا عَلَى صَلَاتِكُمْ وَصَلَاةُ الْوُسْطَى. Guard your prayer and the middle prayer. وَقُومُوا لِلَّهِ قَانِتِينَ. The qunut is in the Fajr prayer. And so that's how he interpreted it. Some of the Maliks would say al-rajih is that it's al-asr, because the dalil is stronger. But the mashhur is that it's fajr. So that's an example of where they could have pulled out a hadith out of their hat that supported their position that it was al-fajr, but they didn't do it because they had taqwa. Da'if. Da'if is an opinion that is not mashhur or rajih, even though da'if opinions can be actually very strong. So if it's extremely da'if, then it's just like Ibn Ayman in the Maliki madhab says that it's valid for women to lead the prayer for other women. That's his opinion in the Maliki madhab. Ibn Wahb is of the opinion that you can join prayers before you leave your house. So if you're going on a journey and you know you're going to, you're leaving at Dhuhr time and you're going to be traveling during Asr time, even though you haven't left your house yet, he was of the opinion that you could join your prayer. That's not mashhur. It's a da'if opinion in the madhab. But it's a strong opinion in that Ibn Wahb is not a weak, his opinions are weighty in the madhab, but it's weak in that it's not considered mashhur or practiced. In the Utbiyah, they permit killing monks and things like that. That's just like thrown out. It's not even considered. In war, because the hadith's very clear. But that opinion's there. So it's just not given any weight at all. But it's mentioned as an opinion. Right. Yeah. Yeah, no, that's it's a really good question. I mean, generally, tradition, the power of tradition is in the past more than the present. I mean, that's part of why tradition is so compelling, is because the giants of the past are so vast. When you read somebody like Ibn al-Qasim or Imam Sahnun and what they knew and the level of taqwa and what they suffered for their beliefs and things like that, it's hard to find compelling contemporary models for those people. In terms of, there's definitely some very solid Maliki scholars today. Sadiq al-Ghiryani in Libya is a very strong Maliki scholar. He has a lot of tarjihat. I'll give you an example of one of his tarjihat that I agree with. In the Maliki madhab, it's an obligation for a woman to pay for a woman's medicine. Her cosmetics. The husband has to pay for her cosmetics, but he doesn't have to pay for her medicine. Now, that probably made sense when medicine wasn't very effective. So, but today, I don't know. I prefer his opinion about that it's an obligation. That's an example of a modern scholar who's, because Islam is a common sense. A lot of Islam is common sense. And sometimes when you see something so against common sense, but you have to have an ability to, a certain level of knowledge before you can really determine that. Sheikh Abdullah bin Bayya is a master of usul, and he's, I trust his opinions. And he has a lot of opinions that my other teachers in Mauritania don't agree with at all. So Mauritanians are extremely strong in guarding the mashhur of the madhab. Unlike Sheikh Abdullah bin Bayya, the traditionalists amongst them tend to be they're just opposed to going against the mashhur. Marabt al-Hajj would say, A'udhu billah. That's how strong it is with him. And like I said, there's a preservation of deen in that, because once you open up that door, it's a slippery slope. You literally can end up without your religion before you know it. So there's a reason why they made that door so narrow. It wasn't just because they were narrow-minded. They really recognized the danger of opening it up. But we're living in a time, it's really challenged the Islamic tradition more than any other time. I mean, this is a very difficult time. And we need creative thinkers, but we also need people that have that intellectual ability to master something, and we don't have enough people like that have done the work or even have the talent. You know, people have different gifts, but we need people that are single-mindedly legal. Like, we need fuqaha, people that's all they want to do. We need that. Like lawyers, you have lawyers. And it takes several years to really master this tradition in any one of the madhabs. If the parents are of different madhab, yeah, that's I mean, generally, you know, the father, it's his deen and his madhab that is mu'tabar. Like, he has the right to raise his children. So if she's a Jewish woman, you know, I'm talking about madhab as well. By qiyas, you know, it's the father has the right to determine the education of the child, religious education. So if he sees fit that he wants them to be raised. On the other hand, Hani she was a great scholar from Egypt, and she had 4 sons. She raised one Maliki, one Shafi'i, one Hanafi, and one Hanbali. So maybe you could switch, you know, one learns the one madhab, the other learns the other. Yeah. But those things are things to think about when you first get married. People tend not to think about them, but they can become issues. And women their madhabs are respected by the other madhabs. So if a woman gets married, she has the right to determine her rights from within her madhab. So in the Maliki madhab, she doesn't have khidma batina, for instance. You know, she doesn't have to serve inside the house. If she's a sharifa, and that is, she has 2 out of the 4 criteria for marriage. So if that's the case, you know, she doesn't have to do dishes or cook or... So if she marries somebody from the Hanafi madhab where she does have khidma batina, she can say, I'm Maliki and you do the dishes if you want them done, you know. And he's supposed to respect that. Mm-hmm. What's that? Well, and that's an opinion. I mean, that is an opinion about Salat al-Wusta. It's not like ulama didn't think of that. And that's why whatever you think of, it's already been thought of. Yeah, once you read the books, whatever you think of, you'll find, oh, like I've thought I'm so clever, and then I find out, you know, oh, that somebody thought of that before me. So there's, you know, people that, if it's reasonable to you, it was reasonable to somebody else before you. Yeah, so that was an opinion. I mean, that they're all wusta. Imam Malik said the Fajr was wusta between the 2 night prayers, Maghrib and Isha, and the 2 day prayers, Dhuhr and Asr. That's one of his proofs. It's also the most difficult of the prayers generally. And that's why it was emphasized, because the Quran emphasizes things that are important and easily lost. So most people, it's easy for them to pray the other prayers. But Fajr, because you're sleeping, it's a harder prayer to perform. Any other questions? So, how much more time do we have? We're done? Is it lunchtime? Is that what they have to go to? Yeah, okay. So tomorrow we'll start on the text, but I hope that was useful, inshallah.